My name is Sienna. For 22 years, I lived as a silhouette in the grand architecture of another person's life. I was the silent partner, the supportive wife, and the keeper of secrets, until the day the man I built an empire for decided I was a redundant asset to be discarded. Before I reveal how I turned my heartbreak into a calculated reckoning, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. Thank you for being here. In a world that often moves too fast to listen, your presence and your time mean everything to me. Thank you for giving a voice to the stories that are so often whispered in the dark. If my journey today touches your heart, or if you find a spark of strength within these words, I humbly invite you to subscribe to our channel Queen's Revenge. We are building a sanctuary here. A place for the resilient, for the underestimated, and for everyone who has ever had to rise from the ashes of betrayal. To those of you who have already joined our family and subscribed, I send you my deepest and most sincere gratitude. May your lives be touched by an unwavering abundance of prosperity, and may your hearts be filled with a happiness so deep and genuine that no shadow can ever dim it. If you are currently feeling invisible or broken, please stay with me until the end. This story is for you. It is a reminder that you are not a victim of your past, but the architect of your future. Now let us return to that cold morning at the mahogany table, where the silence was finally broken. The silence in the dining room was not a void, it was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud woven from 22 years of unspoken compromises and accumulated dust. We sat at the mahogany table, a monstrous polished slab of timber that we had chosen together in a fit of youthful ambitious ecstasy when his first major contract had finally been inked. Back then the wood felt warm, teeming with the promise of 1,000 shared meals and a lifetime of whispered secrets. Tonight it was a mirror of ice, reflecting the hollowed-out versions of the people we had become. It was no longer a piece of furniture, it was an altar of sacrifice, a cold, clinical block for the execution of my life's work. Benjamin pushed the documents toward me. The sound of the paper sliding across the high-gloss finish was a sharp rasping hiss, the sound of a blade being unsheathed. He didn't look at me. He hadn't truly looked at me in years, but tonight, his avoidance was deliberate, a strategic maneuver to bypass the inconvenience of my humanity. He sat there in his charcoal gray suit, the fabric perfectly tensioned over his shoulders, looking every bit the titan of industry I had helped him manufacture. "I need you to sign these, Sienna," he said. His voice was a marvel of corporate detachment. There was no tremor of regret, no jagged edge of sorrow. It was the tone he used for dissolving underperforming subsidiaries or terminating contracts with vendors who no longer served the bottom line. 22 years, Benjamin," I whispered. My voice felt brittle like dried leaves caught in a frost. 22 years reduced to 12 pages of legal font and a signature line? He finally shifted his gaze, but his eyes were like flint, hard, gray, and utterly sparksless. "I've found someone who makes me happy," he said. The word happy hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a grotesque, neon-lit obscenity in the context of our history. It was a word for children and simpletons, yet here he was, using it as a wrecking ball to demolish the cathedral of our marriage. He said it with a chilling lightness, as if happiness were a commodity he had simply decided to source from a more efficient supplier. Happy? I looked down at the papers. The ink seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. My mind drifted back to the wreckage of my youth, the vast, sprawling graveyard of my own ambitions that I had paved over to build his empire. I remembered the nights I spent in the cramped, windowless office of our first startup, my fingers stained with ink and my eyes burning from the glow of the monitor, while he slept the sleep of the entitled, knowing I was there to catch every falling brick. I remembered the graduate school applications I never sent, the career in international finance I traded for the role of a supportive spouse, a title that turned out to be a euphemism for unpaid architect of a man's ego. I had been the soil, the water, and the sun that allowed his ambition to bloom, and now that the garden was lush and the fruit was ripe, he had decided to hire a new gardener, someone younger, someone with vision, someone who hadn't seen the messy, trembling foundations of his success. Vanessa. The name tasted like copper in my mouth. 29 years old. A Stanford MBA. A woman who looked at Benjamin and saw a self-made god, because she wasn't there when he was a panicked boy crying over a failed loan application. She was a consumer of his greatness, whereas I had been its creator. Does she know? I asked, my voice gaining a deceptive velvet-wrapped sharpness. Does she know that the happy man she's with is a construct? That every brick of this house, every digit in your bank account, and every ounce of that confidence you wear like armor was forged in the fire of my labor? Benjamin's jaw tightened. A flicker of annoyance, not guilt but annoyance, crossed his face. Don't be dramatic, Sienna. I'm making sure you're taken care of. The settlement is more than fair. It's generous. Generous. Another stinging word. He spoke as if he were granting me a severance package for a job well done, ignoring the fact that you cannot put a price on the theft of a woman's prime years. He was trying to buy his freedom with the very currency I had helped him accumulate. It was the ultimate irony. The thief offering a tip to the person he had just robbed. I felt a sudden visceral chill, an icy wind blowing through the corridors of my soul. But beneath the frost there was a spark. He saw the silence as defeat. He saw my stillness as the paralysis of a broken woman. He had no idea that for months I had been the ghost in the machine. He had become so convinced of my invisibility that he had forgotten I was the one who knew where all the skeletons were buried, mostly because I was the one who had helped him dig the graves and keep the ledgers. He had underestimated me for so long that it had become his greatest liability. He looked at me and saw a depreciated asset, a woman who had served her purpose and was now taking up valuable space in his portfolio. He didn't see the woman who had spent the last 90 nights in the cold glow of public library computers, stitching together the tapestry of his financial sins. I reached for the Mont Blanc pen, the one I had given him for our 15th anniversary, a tool of power he now used to strike me from his life. My fingers were steady. The tremors had retreated into a deep, dark reservoir of iron-willed resolve. You want your happiness, Benjamin? I said, a faint, ghostly smile touching my lips. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. A mask I had perfected at 1,000 charity galas and corporate dinners where I had played the role of the perfect, silent ornament. I leaned forward, the scent of his expensive cologne, a scent I had chosen for him, filling my nostrils one last time. It smelled of success and betrayal. I signed the first page, then the second. The ink flowed smoothly, a black river marking the end of my life as Mrs. Benjamin Reed. I hope she's worth it, I whispered as I turned to the final page. I hope her connection to the real you is strong enough to withstand what's coming. 'Cause you're right, Benjamin. We have grown apart. I've grown into someone who understands the value of an investment. And you've grown into someone who forgets that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who built it. I signed the last line with a flourish, a definitive jagged stroke of the pen. I closed the leather-bound folder and pushed it back toward him. The mahogany guillotine had fallen. The marriage was dead. Benjamin looked relieved, a small triumphant smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as he tucked the folder under his arm. He stood up, ready to walk out the door and into the arms of his happiness, leaving me in the wreckage of our 22 years. Thank you for making this easy, Sienna, he said, his hand on the doorframe. Oh, Benjamin, I replied, my smile widening just a fraction, sharp enough to draw blood. You have no idea how easy this is going to be. As the door clicked shut behind him, the silence in the room changed. It was no longer heavy. It was expectant. The air was thin, charged with the ozone of an approaching storm. I sat alone at the mahogany table, the queen of a hollowed-out castle, and for the first time in 2 decades I breathed. Not the shallow, restricted breath of a wife, but the deep, lung-filling air of a woman who was about to set the world on fire. The echoes of Benjamin's departure still vibrated in the air, a series of receding thuds that signaled the finality of my execution. The house, once a sanctuary of curated elegance, now felt like a mausoleum, grand, hollow and freezing. I remained seated at the mahogany table, my hands resting on the cold surface where the papers had just been. I looked at my fingers, pale and slightly translucent in the dim light of the chandelier, and realized with a sickening jolt that I had finally become what I had feared most for the last decade. A ghost. But ghosts are not born, they are made. And my haunting began 6 months ago, not with a scream, but with the mundane rustle of paper and the cloying saccharine scent of an interloper. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of stagnant domestic stretch of time that usually felt like a warm blanket. I was performing the ritual I had maintained with religious devotion for 22 years. The laundry. To Benjamin, his designer suits and Egyptian cotton shirts appeared in his closet through some form of corporate magic, pristine and perfectly pressed. He never saw the labor. He never saw me standing over the steam, my face flushed, ensuring that the man the world saw was impeccable. As I reached into the pocket of his charcoal wool blazer, the one he'd worn to late-night strategy sessions all week, my fingers brushed against a small crumpled slip of paper. I pulled it out, expecting a business card or a stray dry cleaning tag. Instead, it was a receipt from the Overlook Hotel. The name itself felt like a cruel cosmic joke. Overlook. For years, that was exactly what he had done to me. I stared at the thermal ink, the letters blurring as my heart began a slow, heavy thrum against my ribs. Room for two. Champagne service. Strawberries. And then the date. October 14th. Our 22nd anniversary. The memory of that night surged back, a wave of cold black water. I had spent that evening in our designer kitchen, the one with the marble countertops he'd insisted on but never cooked upon. I had ordered high-end takeout from the bistro where we'd had our first date, plated it on our wedding china, and opened a bottle of vintage Bordeaux I'd been saving for 5 years. I had sat at this very mahogany table, dressed in a silk slip dress he used to love, watching the candles burn down into puddles of wax. He had called at 8 p.m., his voice sounding harried and distant. "The Henderson merger is hitting a snag, Sam. I'll be at the office all night. Don't wait up. Happy anniversary, honey." I had smiled into the phone, swallowing the lump in my throat, telling him I understood. I told him his success was our success. I had spent the night alone, sipping expensive wine that tasted like ash, convinced that I was being a good wife by sacrificing our milestone for his legacy. But as I stood in the laundry room, the receipt trembling in my hand, I realized that while I was honoring the we, Benjamin was celebrating the him. Then the smell hit me. I leaned in, pressing the lapel of the jacket to my face, desperate to find the familiar scent of his sandalwood cologne, the scent I had picked out for him because it reminded me of the forest behind my childhood home. But the sandalwood was buried. It was suffocating under a thick, oily residue of something alien. Jasmine and vanilla. It was cloying, youthful, and aggressively sweet. It was the scent of someone who wanted to be noticed. Someone who didn't understand that true elegance whispers rather than shouts. It was a sharp, jagged contrast to the fragrance I had worn since our college days. A subtle vintage rose that clung to the skin like a memory. My scent was a soft, enduring grace. This was a loud, temporary intrusion. That jasmine was the smell of my erasure. It was the scent of a woman 20 years younger. A woman who didn't have the fine lines of shared history around her eyes. A woman who hadn't birthed his dreams and buried her own. I felt a phantom pain in my chest, a quiet, stinging ache that radiated from my heart to my fingertips. I looked around the laundry room at the shelves I'd organized, the expensive detergents I'd researched to keep his clothes soft, the basket of his socks I'd mended by hand. I realized then that I wasn't a partner in this house. I was part of the architecture. I was as functional and as invisible as the plumbing, as the structural beams behind the drywall. I had fallen victim to the invisible woman syndrome, a slow, calcifying process where a wife becomes so synonymous with the home that she ceases to be a person within it. To Benjamin, I was no longer Sienna, the woman who had helped him draft his first business plan on a coffee-stained napkin. I was merely the wife, a domestic utility, a social accessory, a silent witness to his ascent. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the hallway, clutching the receipt like a weapon. I looked at my reflection, searching for the girl who used to laugh until her sides ached, the girl who had a degree in finance and a hunger for the world. She was still there, buried under layers of supportive smiles and agreeable nods. My hair was still thick, my eyes still bright, but I looked at myself and saw a translucent figure. I was fading. Benjamin would come home and look right through me. He would talk about his day, his clients, his vision, and I would provide the necessary punctuation, the "how wonderful, dear," the "you're so brilliant, Ben." I had become the echo of his ego. That night, when he finally returned home smelling of mints and desperation, I didn't confront him. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the receipt in his face. Instead, I tucked it back into his pocket with a chilling surgical precision. I ironed his shirt for the next morning, my movements fluid and robotic. As I watched the steam rise from the fabric, I realized that if I was going to be a ghost, I was going to be the kind that haunts. I was done being the foundation he stood upon. I was going to become the cracks in the walls. The ache in my chest didn't vanish, but it hardened into something cold and crystalline. I looked at my reflection one last time and whispered to the woman in the glass. He thinks he can replace the architect and keep the building. He has no idea that I am the only thing holding the roof up. Back in the present, the silence of the dining room was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock, a gift from my parents that he'd never liked. I stood up from the mahogany table, my movements no longer heavy. The invisible woman was gone. In her place was something much more dangerous. A woman who had seen the end, and had spent the last 6 months ensuring that when the house finally fell, she wouldn't be the one caught in the rubble. I inhaled deeply, but the scent of jasmine and vanilla no longer had the power to choke me. I smelled the faint, lingering trail of his expensive leather shoes as he walked away, and I felt a surge of something that felt suspiciously like peace. He wanted a divorce because he found someone who made him happy. He was chasing a scent, a fleeting vapor of jasmine. He didn't realize that by discarding me, he was removing the only structural integrity his life had ever known. I walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking sharply against the marble. The ghost was finished with her mourning. Now it was time for the haunting to truly begin. I walked past the room Benjamin called my den. A space of pristine built-in bookshelves and a desk of reclaimed oak that had never seen a drop of ink or a bead of sweat. It was a showroom, a stage set designed to suggest a woman of intellect without actually allowing her the room to exercise it. I ran my hand over the cool wood, and the sensation triggered a memory so sharp it felt like a paper cut to the soul. I was transported back to our first headquarters, a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a walk-up that smelled of radiator fluid and overboiled cabbage. That was 22 years ago, when we was a sacred covenant, not a linguistic inconvenience. In those early days, Benjamin Reed Enterprises didn't exist in glass and steel. It lived in the frantic scribbles on the backs of envelopes and the rhythmic clicking of my old laptop at 3 in the morning. Benjamin had the charisma, a predatory golden boy charm that could sell ice to an Arctic winter, but I had the mechanics. I was the one with the high honors business degree, the one who understood the jagged architecture of a balance sheet and the delicate psychology of market penetration. We were a symbiotic machine. He was the face, the dazzling sun that blinded clients into submission, and I was the engine room hidden away in the dark, churning out the power that kept him radiant. I remember the first 5 years with a bittersweet ache that tastes like cheap coffee and ironclad resolve. We worked in a fever, fueled by the terrifying, exhilarating proximity to failure. I was his ghostwriter, his strategist, his unpaid COO. I crafted the very proposals that would eventually become the foundation of his legend. I remember the Henderson acquisition, the deal that transformed Benjamin from a hopeful interloper into a recognized titan. I stayed awake for 48 hours straight, my eyes bloodshot and my brain vibrating with caffeine, refining the financial models and anticipating every possible objection the board could throw at us. When the contract was signed, Benjamin had come home and swept me into his arms, spinning me around that cramped, dim apartment. "We did it, Sam," he had whispered into my hair. "You're the brain and I'm the heart. We're unstoppable." But success is a slow-acting poison for some men. It doesn't change them. It merely unmasks them. As the zeros in our bank account multiplied, the we began to fracture. It started with the graceful step back. I remember the night clearly. We were dining at a restaurant where the napkins cost more than our first month's rent. Benjamin took my hand, his eyes shining with a patronizing warmth that I mistook for love. "Sam, look at how far we've come," he'd said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. "You've worked so hard. You've been in the trenches for 5 years. But the company is at a different stage now. We need to project a certain image. I need you to focus on making our home a sanctuary. I need you on the charity boards, at the galas, being the woman who makes everyone else want to do business with me just to be in your orbit." He didn't say, "I want to be the only person in the spotlight." He said, "You've done enough." He didn't say, "Your intellect threatens my narrative of the self-made man." He said, "Focus on making our life beautiful." It was a masterpiece of manipulation. He framed my professional exile as a reward for my labor. He convinced me that trading my spreadsheets for seating charts was a promotion to royalty. And I, blinded by the flickering light of our shared history, accepted the crown. I didn't realize it was a crown of thorns designed to keep me stationary. The transition was a slow-motion theft of my identity. My business degree, once a sharp tool I wielded with precision, was folded and tucked away like an old wedding dress, eventually gathering dust in the back of my mind. I was draped in silk and ushered into a world of social etiquette that felt like a series of gilded cages. I became the queen's revenge before I even knew I needed a throne. I was the decorative centerpiece at his power lunches, the gracious hostess who smoothed over his rough edges with a smile and a perfectly timed anecdote. I watched him grow. I watched him adopt the language of a solo conqueror. In interviews he spoke of my vision and my risks. The we that had built the empire was edited out, like a troublesome footnote in a historical text. I became the lovely wife Samantha, a beautiful footnote in the biography of Benjamin Reed. Standing in my silent, useless office now, I realized that for 17 years, I had been an accomplice in my own erasure. I had allowed him to bury my ambitions under layers of Chanel and cashmere. Every charity gala I organized was a funeral for a deal I could have closed. Every polite conversation about the season was a shroud for a mind that could have outperformed any analyst on his payroll. It was a theft of time, the only currency that can never be recovered. He hadn't just stolen my youth, he had stolen my potential. He had used my labor to build a ladder, and once he reached the top, he had kicked the ladder away and told me to enjoy the view from the ground. A sharp, jagged laugh escaped my throat, echoing in the sterile room. Benjamin thought he had successfully decommissioned me. He thought that by surrounding me with luxury, he had lobotomized my ambition. He truly believed that the woman who had built his empire had forgotten how the architecture worked. He was wrong. The skills I had used to build Benjamin Reed Enterprises hadn't vanished. They had simply gone underground. For 22 years, I had been the silent observer of his every move, his every flaw, his every legal shortcut. I knew the company's DNA because I had written its first sequence. I walked to the oak desk and opened the bottom drawer. Tucked behind a stack of high-end stationery was a small encrypted external drive. My hands didn't tremble. The bittersweet nostalgia was gone, burned away by a cold, incandescent clarity. Benjamin had spent years trying to turn me into a ghost, into a piece of architectural scenery. But he forgot one fundamental rule of the empires he so admired. The person who designs the fortress is the only one who knows exactly where the hidden passage to the vault is. I wasn't just his wife. I was his architect. And I was about to show him exactly what happens when you try to evict the person who drew the blueprints. I walked out of the office, the silk of my robe whispering against my skin like the ghosts of the women I could have been. They weren't mourning anymore. They were waiting. The transition from partner to parasite, at least in Benjamin's eyes, did not happen with a bang. It happened with a beep. Specifically, the sharp electronic chirp of the biometric scanner he had installed on his home office door 3 years ago. It was a sleek, brushed metal device that glowed with a cold, sapphire light, a digital eye that recognized his thumbprint but remained stubbornly blind to mine. I remember standing in the hallway, my hand frozen in midair as I reached for the handle, only to be met by that dismissive, high-pitched rejection. It was the physical manifestation of a border I hadn't realized was being drawn. "Corporate security requirements, Sam," he'd said when I questioned it, not even looking up from his smartphone. He was leaned against the kitchen island, the sunlight catching the silver at his temples, making him look like the very picture of distinguished success. "We're handling sensitive data now. Federal contracts. It's for your protection as much as the company's. I don't want you getting caught in the crossfire of a regulatory audit. For your protection." Those 3 words were the silk ribbons he used to bind my hands. In the beginning, his patronizing comments were draped in the velvet of affection. When I would ask about a dip in the quarterly projections or a strange shell company name I saw on a stray fax, he would chuck me under the chin, his eyes crinkling with a mock-heroic warmth. "Don't worry your pretty head about the complicated stuff, Sam," he would coo, as if he were talking to a particularly bright golden retriever. "You've done your time in the trenches. Go pick out the tiles for the guest bathroom." Let me handle the boring numbers. At first, I allowed myself to be anesthetized by it. I wanted to believe that after the grueling years of building the empire, I earned this luxury of ignorance. But slowly, the pretty head comments began to feel less like a compliment and more like a lobotomy. He was systematically amputating my intellect, cauterizing the part of me that understood the language of commerce until I was nothing more than a well-dressed ghost drifting through a house of secrets. But Benjamin had forgotten one crucial detail. He was the one who had taught me how to hunt for discrepancies. He was the one who had praised my bloodhound's nose for financial irregularities when we were building the firm. You don't spend 5 years as a forensic architect of a startup and suddenly lose the ability to see when the walls are leaning. The fire didn't start with a roar. It started as a simmer, a low-grade thermal energy beneath my skin as I began to notice the fiscal dissonance of our lives. We lived in a world of lavish. The primary residence was a $20 million fortress of glass and limestone. Then came the Eagle's Nest, the vacation home in Aspen that appeared almost overnight. A sprawling masterpiece of cedar and stone with a heated driveway and a wine cellar that held vintages older than our marriage. Then there was the vintage car collection. The 1963 Jaguar E-Type, the Ferrari 250 GT, the Porsche 356. These weren't just cars, they were trophies of an unimaginable surplus. I sat in my den one rainy afternoon, the one Benjamin had designed to be a feminine retreat, and I pulled up our joint tax returns from the last 3 years. The ones he'd always presented to me as a single signature page tucked into a leather folder. Just sign here, honey. Our CPA handled everything. It's all standard. But I hadn't just signed this time. I had made a copy. As I laid the documents out on the floor, hidden beneath a stack of Architectural Digest magazines, the numbers began to scream. Our declared income was substantial, certainly, enough for a top-tier life. But it was nowhere near enough to sustain the acquisitions of the last 36 months. The math was broken. There was a delta of millions of dollars, a phantom wealth that seemed to materialize from the ether. I felt a cold sweat prickle my scalp. My pretty head was doing the calculus he thought I'd forgotten. Benjamin Reed Enterprises was a consulting firm, but these numbers suggested a shadow empire. Large sums were moving through entities I didn't recognize. LLCs with names like Blue Horizon Holdings and Apex Stratagem. They were shell companies, hollow vessels designed to carry weight without leaving a footprint. I remembered the nights he'd spent on the back patio, his voice a low, jagged murmur into his second cell phone. I remembered the way he would snap his laptop shut the moment I entered the room, his smile appearing like a curtain being drawn over a crime scene. "Everything okay with the Henderson account, Ben?" I had asked once, trying to keep my voice light, the rose-scented air of the garden feeling suddenly heavy. "Fine, Sam. Just some details Vanessa is handling. She's a shark, that one. Reminds me of you, actually, back in the day." Back in the day. That was the sting. He spoke of my competence as a relic, a museum piece from a primitive era of his life. To him, Vanessa, his executive assistant with the perfect hair and the predatory MBA, was the new model, the upgraded software. I was the legacy system, cluttered with sentiment and pretty thoughts, waiting to be decommissioned. The simmering fire in my chest flared into a white-hot spark. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to erase the person who knew what he used to be. He thought that by locking his office he had locked my mind. He thought that by calling me pretty, he had made me stupid. I looked at the blue light of the biometric scanner glowing in the hallway like a taunting eye. He had built a fortress of exclusion, thinking he was keeping me out. He didn't realize that when you exclude the person who helped you lay the foundation, you leave her on the outside with the blueprints and a clear view of the cracks. I stood up, my knees cracking slightly, the only sign of the 22 years I had given him. I wasn't the grieving wife anymore. I wasn't the decorative ornament. I was a woman who had realized she had been underestimated by the person she trusted most, and that realization was the most potent fuel I had ever known. He thought I was a ghost in his house. Fine. I would be a poltergeist. I would move through his digital shadows. I would learn the rhythms of his security. I would find the back door he'd forgotten to guard because he was too busy looking at his own reflection and the jasmine-scented girl who mirrored his ego. The fire beneath my skin settled into a steady, controlled burn. I walked to the hallway and stood before the locked door. I didn't try to touch the scanner. I didn't have to. I just stood there in the silence, a soft, dangerous smile playing on my lips. Don't worry your pretty head, Benjamin, I whispered to the cold metal. I'm not looking for a way-in anymore. I'm looking for the lever that brings the whole thing down. I turned and walked away, my footsteps silent on the deep pile of the Persian rug. The exclusion wasn't my prison, it was my cover. And in the darkness of his underestimation, I was going to become his inevitable ruin. To dismantle a god, one must first learn to walk among the mortals unnoticed. For months I lived a life partitioned by a jagged, invisible glass. By day, I was the polished, rose-scented ornament of the Reed estate, a woman who spent her hours discussing silk swatches for the library or chairing charity galas for underprivileged youth, a term Benjamin used with a sickening performative empathy. But the moment his charcoal sedan vanished down the driveway, the ornament shattered, and the predator emerged from the shards. My clandestine pilgrimage began 30 miles away, in a neighboring county where the air smelled less of manicured lawns and more of exhaust and damp asphalt. I avoided our local library, where the staff knew me as the lovely Mrs. Reed, who donated leather-bound classics. Instead, I sought sanctuary in a low-slung brick building with buzzing fluorescent lights that cast a sickly, jaundiced hue over everything. It was a purgatory of linoleum and old paper, and it was perfect. I walked to the front desk, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs. The librarian, a woman with skin like crumpled parchment and eyes that saw only Dewey Decimal codes, pushed a sign-in sheet toward me. With a steady hand I reclaimed a ghost. Sienna Davis. Seeing my maiden name on the page felt like a baptism. Sienna Davis was the woman who had graduated at the top of her class, the woman who could dissect a corporate ledger with surgical malevolence. Mrs. Reed was the woman being slowly suffocated. Sienna Davis was the woman holding the knife. I found a terminal in the far corner, tucked behind a rack of outdated periodicals. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the quiet desperation of other strangers. I sat down, my fingers hovering over a keyboard sticky with the residue of 1,000 anonymous lives, and created my digital bunker, truthfinder2023@gmail.com. This was not just an email address. It was a ledger of my own survival. It was a vault where I would store the fragments of Benjamin's soul, or the lack thereof. The work was a meticulous, grinding pain. It required the patience of a diamond cutter and the nerves of a bomb technician. Back at the house, I played the role of the oblivious wife, with a talent that would have shamed an Oscar winner. I would wait until Benjamin was in the shower or on his back patio, murmuring into his second phone, the one I'd found tucked in his golf bag, and I would begin my harvest. I became a ghost in my own hallways. I learned which floorboards groaned and which hinges whispered. I bought a high-resolution camera that fit into the palm of my hand, a device I hid inside a hollowed-out copy of The Age of Innocence. When Benjamin left his laptop open to fetch a drink, I didn't just look. I recorded. I photographed tax returns, wire transfer receipts to Cayman accounts, and internal memos from Apex Stratagem, the shell company that seemed to be the primary vessel for his creative accounting. The most agonizing part was the silence. To be a forensic predator, you must first learn to be a professional listener. I began recording our dinner conversations under the guise of improving my voice for public speaking. I captured his patronizing laughs, his don't worry your pretty head dismissals, and the moments when he grew careless, boasting about outsmarting the feds or shifting the Henderson weight. One Tuesday night I stood outside his locked office, my ear pressed against the cold wood. Inside I heard the low melodic laugh of Vanessa on speakerphone. "He has no idea, Ben," she purred. "The wife is so checked out. She's too busy picking out drapes to notice a $20 million leak." "Sienna." Benjamin's voice was thick with a smug, oily satisfaction. "She's harmless. She's lost the edge she had in college. Now she just wants to be comfortable. As long as the wine cellar is full and the credit cards work, she won't ask a single question." I stood there in the dark, the rose scent of my perfume feeling like a shroud. A single icy tear tracked down my cheek, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer crystalline purity of my rage. He didn't just betray me. He pitted me. He looked at the architect of his empire and saw a domesticated animal. I retreated to my den, the room he'd designed to keep me contained, and pulled out my phone. I uploaded the recording to truth.finder2023. Each click of the send button felt like a hammer blow against his pedestal. By the time I returned to the fluorescent purgatory of the library the next day, I had a dossier that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. I sat at the terminal, my eyes burning from lack of sleep, and organized the evidence. Folder 1, Tax Evasion. Folder 2, Offshore Accounts. Folder 3, The Pension Raid. That last one, the pension fund, was the jagged glass in my throat. I had found the spreadsheets showing the systematic diversion of employee retirement funds into his own private ventures. These were people I knew. The janitor Arthur, who had worked for us for 15 years. Sarah, the receptionist who was saving for her daughter's college. Benjamin was stealing their sunsets to buy himself a brighter noon. It was in that moment, sitting under the flickering lights of the library, that the last vestige of Sienna the wife died. There was no more we. There was no more us. There was only the objective. I looked at my reflection in the dark monitor. My face was pale, my eyes hollowed by the intensity of my focus. I looked like a woman who had lost everything, my marriage, my youth, my trust. And yet I had never felt more powerful. Because when you have nothing left to lose, you are no longer a victim. You are an inevitability. Benjamin thought he was discarding a redundant asset. He thought he was closing a chapter on a boring middle-aged woman. He had no idea that he was actually the one being studied. He was the specimen under the microscope and I was the one with the slides and the scalpel. I signed out of the computer, the plastic keys clicking one last time like a ticking clock. I walked to the librarian and handed back the sign-in sheet. "Thank you, Sienna," she said, her voice dry as dead leaves, not even looking up. "You're welcome," I replied, my voice a sharp, cutting blade. I walked out into the cold afternoon air. The weight of the Reed name feeling like a leaden coat I was ready to shed. The double life was exhausting, yes. The facade was soul-crushing, certainly. But as I drove back toward the limestone fortress that was no longer my home, I felt a strange, terrifying calm. The Library of Secrets was full. The case was built. Now all I had to do was wait for him to think he was winning. I would smile. I would sign. And then I would pull the thread that would unravel the world he had stolen from me. Benjamin Reed wanted to find happiness with a younger model. He was about to find out that happiness is a very expensive thing to buy with other people's lives. And I was the one who was going to send the bill. Isolation is a cold, hollow chamber where every thought echoes with the sound of your own heartbeat. A constant reminder that you are the only one left standing in the ruins of your trust. For months, I had been an island. A solitary figure navigating the treacherous waters of Benjamin's deceit. But as the dossier in Truth.Finder 2023 grew, so did the terrifying realization that I was drowning in my own evidence. I had the what and the where, but I lacked the how, the legal armor required to survive the explosion I was about to trigger. I needed a ghost from my past, someone whose eyes were trained to find the truth in the spaces between the numbers. I needed Sarah Williams. In college, Sarah and I were the double S of the business department, two women who could outcalculate and outmaneuver any man in the room. We had shared a dorm room, 1,000 cups of lukewarm coffee, and the fierce, unadulterated ambition of youth. But while I had chosen to tether my light to Benjamin's rising sun, Sarah had chosen the shadows of the law, becoming a specialist with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We had drifted apart, our friendship another casualty of the Reed era. Buried under the weight of Benjamin's disapproval of anyone who knew me before he made me. I called her from a burner phone, my voice trembling as I uttered a name I hadn't spoken in 5 years. The silence on the other end was a jagged blade, until she finally spoke. "Sam? Is that really you?" We met 40 miles away, in a nondescript cafe that smelled of burnt beans and industrial-grade cleanser. It was a place for people who didn't want to be found, a sterile sanctuary where the fluorescent lights hummed with a low, anxious frequency. Sarah was waiting in a corner booth, looking exactly as I remembered, sharp, understated, and utterly formidable. Her hair was a practical, silver-streaked bob, and her eyes, those intelligent, predatory eyes that had once dissected market trends with me, now scanned the room with a professional caution that chilled me to the bone. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Sam," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of my mind. "I think I am a ghost, Sarah," I replied, sliding into the vinyl booth. The seat was cracked, the stuffing poking through like an old wound. We didn't waste time on pleasantries. The 22-year gap between us was too vast for small talk. I leaned in, the faint scent of my rose perfume clashing with the bitter aroma of the cafe. I began the dance we both knew I was performing. "I'm here because of a friend," I said, the lie tasting like copper in my mouth. "She's in a complicated situation. Her husband, a man of significant influence, has been creative with his accounting for years. She's found things, Sarah. Things that could dismantle an entire empire." Sarah didn't blink. She merely adjusted her glasses, the light reflecting off the lenses and obscuring her expression. "How creative, Sam? We talking rounding errors? Or are we talking the kind of architecture that requires a shovel to uncover?" "The latter," I whispered. "Offshore accounts, shell companies, and the employee pension fund." Sarah's posture shifted, a subtle tightening of her shoulders that told me I had hit a nerve. "The pension fund. That not just fraud, Sam. That's a blood sacrifice. That's stealing the futures of the people who trusted him." "Hypothetically," I corrected, my voice cracking, "what happens to the wife? If she knew nothing? Or if she suspected but was kept in the dark? If her name is on those joint returns because she was told to not worry her pretty head?" Sarah leaned across the table, her gaze piercing through my facade. "In the eyes of the government, ignorance is rarely an excuse. If you sign the return, you're liable for the contents. Unless..." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a lifeline. "Unless you can prove you're an innocent spouse." "Innocent spouse relief," I repeated, the words feeling like a prayer. "It's a narrow gate, Sam," Sarah warned, her professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal a flash of genuine concern. "You have to prove that at the time you signed you didn't know and had no reason to know that there was an understatement of tax. You have to prove that it would be unfair to hold you liable, taking into account all the facts and circumstances." She began to list the criteria, her words a clinical, cold assessment of my life. Educational background, participation in business matters, lavish expenditures, systematic exclusion. As she spoke, I felt the walls of my isolation closing in. To save myself, I had to prove that I was a victim of the very man I had once vowed to protect. I had to document my own degradation. "If this friend wants to survive," Sarah continued, her voice gaining a sharp, IRS-grade intensity, "she needs to become a ghost herself. She needs to document every time he shut a door in her face, every time he refused to answer a financial question, every lavish gift that felt like hush money. She needs to show that she wasn't a partner, but a hostage to his success." The personal grief I had been suppressing surged into my throat. To the world, I was the co-founder of Benjamin Reed Enterprises. To the law, I was either a criminal accomplice or a pathetic, blinded wife. There was no middle ground for a woman of my intelligence. To win my freedom, I had to admit that I had allowed my mind to be shackled by a man who saw me as an accessory. "It sounds lonely," I said, my eyes welling with tears I refused to let fall. "It is the loneliest path there is," Sarah replied, "because the person you're protecting yourself from is the one who knows your passwords, your habits, and your heart. You're sleeping in the enemy's camp, Sam. Every night you spend in that house is a gamble." She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, a startling contrast to the icy paralysis of my soul. "If this friend has evidence," Sarah whispered, "she needs to get it to the right people. But she has to do it perfectly. One slip, one hint that she's onto him, and he'll burn the evidence, and maybe her along with it." In that moment, the tentative hope I had been nurturing flickered into a steady flame. I wasn't just an island anymore. I had found a navigator. Sarah wasn't just a friend from the past. She was the forensic ghost who could see the truth I had been trying to hide from myself. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, withdrawing her hand as the waiter approached. "Just tell your friend to be careful. The IRS doesn't have a heart, Sam. They have a calculator. Make sure her numbers are the ones that tell the true story." As I drove away from the cafe, the distance between me and the Reed estate felt shorter than ever. The isolation was still there, a cold companion in the passenger seat, but it was no longer absolute. I had the mechanics. I had the path. And I had the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that I was no longer just a woman being discarded. I was a woman preparing for war. Benjamin thought he was leaving me with nothing. He didn't realize he was leaving me with the one thing he couldn't control: the truth and the forensic ghost who knew exactly how to weaponize it. The innocent spouse was a role I would play with the performance of a lifetime, while the architect of ruin did the real work in the dark. Carelessness is the ultimate arrogance of the powerful. For 22 years, Benjamin Reed had moved through the world with the precision of a Swiss watch, every lie calibrated, every deception oiled and silent. But greed is a corrosive substance. Eventually, it eats through the casing. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the day the universe finally tired of his theater. Benjamin had left for the airport in a frantic rush, his mind likely already miles ahead in a hotel suite with Vanessa. For the first time in our marriage, he had forgotten his tablet. It sat on the nightstand, a sleek slab of obsidian and glass, humming with the digital secrets of a man who thought he was untouchable. I stared at it for a long time. My heart wasn't racing, it was cold. I felt like a coroner approaching a long-sealed tomb. I knew his passcode, not because he had given it to me, but because I had watched the reflection of his fingers in the window glass a dozen times. 0-8-1-5. Our wedding anniversary. The irony was a jagged blade. He used the date of our union to lock away the evidence of its destruction. As the screen bloomed to life, I felt a wave of visceral nausea. This wasn't just a tablet. It was a map of a dark territory I had occupied without ever knowing the terrain. I bypassed the photos. I didn't need to see the digital echoes of his infidelity. I had already smelled the jasmine and seen the receipts. I went straight for the hidden partitions, the folders labeled with innocuous names like lawn maintenance and HVAC repairs. Inside, I found the Apex stratagem ledgers. As I scrolled, the air in the bedroom grew thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the sheer weight of the numbers. I wasn't looking at creative accounting anymore. I was looking at a masterpiece of federal crime. $28,452,100. The number burned into my retinas. $28 million in diverted revenue, falsified losses, and offshore transfers that bypassed the Treasury entirely. It was a geometric betrayal. I saw the Cayman accounts, the Swiss holdings, the shell companies that acted like a series of mirrors, reflecting wealth away from the light of the IRS. But the most agonizing revelation wasn't the theft from the government. It was the realization that I had been the unwitting accomplice to a common criminal. I looked at the signatures on the digital filings, my name, scanned and pasted with a precision that made me want to scrub my skin raw. He hadn't just used my labor to build his empire. He had used my identity as a human shield. The nausea hit me then, a cold, acidic tide rising from my gut. I stumbled to the bathroom and sank to the marble floor, my forehead resting against the porcelain. I didn't cry. Tears are for the heartbroken. This was the physical rejection of a life built on a lie. I realized that the man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed my career and my youth for, didn't actually exist. Benjamin Reed was a ghost, a hollow shell filled with nothing but avarice and the terrifying coldness of a sociopath. I thought of the early years, the ramen noodles, the cold studio apartment, the way we had celebrated when we made our first $50,000. I had thought we were building a future. I didn't know I was merely the getaway driver for a 22-year heist. I sat on the floor for an hour, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. This was the moral crossroads. I could take this information to a divorce attorney and squeeze him for every penny. I could use it as leverage to keep the house, the cars, the Aspen retreat. I could bargain for a comfortable, quiet exit. But as I looked at the spreadsheet of the pension fund, the final $4 million raid that had left our employees' futures in tatters, the bargain died in my throat. Revenge is a base instinct, a hot, messy thing. But justice? Justice is cold. Justice is a requirement. If I stayed silent, if I used his crimes to fund my own comfort, I was no better than the girl with the jasmine perfume. I would be just another person Benjamin had bought. I stood up, my legs trembling but my mind as sharp as a diamond. I went back to the tablet and began the slow, agonizing process of transferring the data to Truth.Finder 2023. Each file was a nail in his coffin. Each PDF was a bridge I was burning behind me. That evening, I did something I had never done before. I followed him. I sat in my car, parked half a block away from a boutique bistro downtown, the kind of place where the lighting is dim and the privacy is expensive. I watched through the window as Benjamin leaned across the table, his hand covering Vanessa's. He was laughing, that rich, charismatic laugh that had once made my world feel safe. Vanessa looked at him with an adoration that was almost painful to witness. She saw the Titan. She saw the self-made man. She saw the happiness he had promised. She had no idea she was holding the hand of a man whose world was currently being dismantled by a woman she considered invisible. I watched them for 20 minutes, the silence of my car a heavy, suffocating shroud. I felt the final death of my love for him. It wasn't a dramatic event. It was the simple, quiet sound of a light going out. There was no more anger, no more jealousy, no more what-ifs. There was only the objective. He looked at his watch, the Patek Philippe I had bought him for his 40th, and whispered something in her ear. She giggled, a bright, youthful sound that felt like a mockery of the 22 years I had spent in his shadow. I realized then that my revenge would not be a scream. It wouldn't be a scene in a restaurant, or a tearful confrontation, or a dramatic exit. Those are the weapons of the weak. My revenge would be a whisper. A whisper to the IRS. A whisper to the SEC. A whisper to the federal prosecutors who would find the breadcrumbs I had spent months laying out. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine purring with a quiet, lethal efficiency. I looked one last time at the window of the bistro. Benjamin was raising a glass of champagne, celebrating a future that was already over. "Enjoy the vintage, Benjamin," I whispered to the windshield. "It's the last thing you'll ever taste that isn't ash." I drove away, the scent of my own rose perfume filling the car. A soft, enduring fragrance that no longer felt like a shroud. Felt like a victory. The innocent spouse was dead. The architect of ruin was just getting started. The death of love is a terrible thing, but the birth of justice is a fire. And as I drove through the night, I felt the warmth of that fire for the first time in 2 decades. Benjamin Reed wanted a divorce to find happiness. I would give him the divorce, but I would keep the empire, and I would give the wreckage to the people he had robbed. The whisper was coming, and by the time it reached him, it would be a hurricane. If the previous revelations were a cold rain, this discovery was a volcanic eruption that charred the very last of my hesitation. I sat in the dark of my den, the only light emanating from the stolen digital files on my laptop, a glowing necropsy of a dying corporation. I had spent hours tracing the flow of capital through Apex Stratagem, but as I delved into the Employee Benefits Administration folder, the numbers began to bleed. This wasn't just tax fraud. It was a slow-motion massacre of the people who had stood by us when we had nothing. $4.3 million. That was the sum Benjamin and Vanessa had siphoned from the Employee Pension Fund over the last 36 months. They hadn't just stolen from the government. They had reached into the future of every person who walked the halls of the Meridian building and strangled it. They had replaced stable, diversified retirement assets with worthless preferred shares in Benjamin's own shell companies, paper-thin promises backed by nothing but his own arrogance. I stared at the screen, my breath hitching in my chest. I saw the digital trail of transfers, many of them time-stamped during the same hours Benjamin was supposedly working late with Vanessa. In fact, her digital signature was on half the authorization forms. She wasn't just the new happiness. She was the bookkeeper of the betrayal, the jasmine-scented parasite feeding on the lifeblood of our staff. A gallery of faces began to flicker in my mind, not the high-powered clients or the board members, but the people Benjamin considered furniture. I thought of Arthur, the night janitor who had been with us for 18 years. He was 64, a man with calloused hands and a quiet, dignified smile who often shared stories about the granddaughter he was going to send to college. I thought of Claudia, the receptionist who had stayed late 1,000 nights to help me organize files during the early years, whose only dream was a modest cottage by the lake for her retirement. They were the true architects of his empire. They were the ones who did the grinding, unglamorous work that allowed Benjamin to play the role of the visionary. And he had repaid their loyalty by stealing their sunsets. He was burning their life savings to pay for Vanessa's designer handbags and his own vintage car collection. The nausea from the morning was gone, replaced by a white-hot, incandescent fury that felt like iron in my veins. This was no longer about a marriage that had failed. This was no longer about a woman who had been discarded. This was a moral crusade. My heart, which had felt like a wounded bird for months, suddenly hardened into a weapon. I felt a righteous ancient rage, the kind that belongs to a mother protecting her young, or a guardian standing at the gate. I had been the innocent spouse long enough. Now I would be the scourge. You coward! I whispered into the empty room, my voice shaking with the sheer force of my indignation. You wretched, small-souled coward. He thought he was the apex predator, but he had forgotten that he was only at the top because I had built the mountain. He didn't understand that by attacking the people under my protection, he had voided any lingering shred of mercy I might have felt for him. I had spent 22 years nurturing his dreams, but I would not spend another second allowing him to devour the dreams of others. The generous settlement he had pushed across the mahogany table now felt like a bribe to keep me silent about a mass murder of hopes. He wanted me to take my 3 years of income and fade away while Arthur worked until he died and Claudia lost her home. I reached for my phone and dialed Sarah's burner number. My hand was as steady as a surgeon's. Sarah, I said when she picked up, my voice a low, lethal hum. The friend found something else. It's not just the IRS anymore. It's the pension fund. $4.3 million. Gone. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Sam, that's ERISA violations. That's prison time. That's federal territory with a very long reach. Good, I replied. I want the reach to be long enough to pull him into the abyss. I'm done being innocent. I want to be a witness. I want to be the evidence. I want to burn the whole thing down. Sam, if you do this, you might lose the house, the assets, everything, Sarah warned. The government will claw back everything he built with that money. Let it burn, I said, a jagged, terrifying smile touching my lips. I'd rather live in a one-bedroom apartment with a clear conscience than in a limestone fortress built on the stolen lives of my friends. I don't want his money. I want his downfall. I want the people he robbed to get their lives back. I hung up and went back to the computer. I began a new file, one I didn't send to a library or a remote server. I labeled it The Reckoning. I compiled every pension transfer, every email between Benjamin and Vanessa discussing asset reallocation, every forged document. I annotated them with the names of the employees affected. I spent the rest of the night working with a feverish, cold-blooded efficiency. I wasn't Sienna the wife, the rose-scented ornament. I was the architect of justice. I was the woman who was going to dismantle the Meridian building stone by stone, not because I was hurt, but because it was the right thing to do. As the sun began to peek through the designer drapes of my bedroom, I looked at the finished dossier. It was a masterpiece of ruin. It was the match that would ignite the conflagration. I thought of Benjamin, likely sleeping soundly next to his jasmine-scented accomplice, dreaming of his new, happy life. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he had relegated me to the past. He had no idea that the past was about to become his judge, his jury, and his executioner. You should have left me with my dignity, Benjamin, I whispered to the morning light. You should have kept your hands off the people who trusted us. The righteous fury in my chest felt like a steady, glowing coal. I wasn't just leaving. I was reclaiming the power I had given him, and using it to destroy the monster he had become. The kingdom was built on sand and stolen blood. It was time for it to fall. And I was the one who was going to pull the lever. The morning of the execution broke with a clarity that felt invasive. The sun spilled across the marble floors of our foyer, sharp and unforgiving, illuminating every speck of dust I had missed in my 22 years of domestic vigilance. I woke before the alarm, my body already tuned to the frequency of a coming storm. There was no trembling, no frantic heartbeat. There was only a terrifying, exhilarating calm, the kind of stillness that precedes a tectonic shift. I walked to my closet and bypassed the morning blacks and the neutral taupes of the supportive wife. My hand moved with a mind of its own, toward the back of the wardrobe, pulling out a garment I hadn't worn in years, the cobalt silk sheath. It was Benjamin's favorite. He used to say the color turned my eyes into sapphires, that it made me look ethereal and accessible. To him, this dress was the uniform of the woman he thought he had successfully tamed, the woman who laughed at his jokes and smoothed over his ego at every gala. Today, I wore it as a mocking tribute, a final shroud for the version of me he was currently murdering. I slipped the silk over my head. It felt like cool water against my skin. A second skin for a woman who was shedding her old one like a snake. I spent an hour on my face. I didn't want to look tired. I wanted to look like a masterpiece of composure. I painted my lips a muted, sophisticated berry, a color that suggested a quiet, elegant grief, but left no trace of the fire burning beneath. I was a work of art, a facade of resignation so perfect it was lethal. The sound of his Italian shoes clicking across the marble foyer at 8 a.m. was a familiar rhythm, but today it sounded like the ticking of a countdown. I descended the stairs, my movements fluid and ghost-like. Benjamin was in the kitchen, leaning against the island where we had once shared late-night wine and early morning dreams. Beside him stood Alan Grossman, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a soul made of billable hours. He was Benjamin's personal attorney. Not our attorney, a distinction that felt like a fresh slap to the face. The leather portfolio between them was a monolith of my erasure. "Samantha," Benjamin said. His voice was steady, practiced, stripped of the intimacy of a husband and replaced with the efficiency of a CEO. He looked at the blue dress, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of something, memory perhaps or a twig snap of regret, flickered in his flinty eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by the cool detachment of a man closing a difficult deal. "Would either of you like coffee?" I asked. My voice was a marvel of neutral grace. I sounded like the perfect hostess, even as I was preparing to serve them their own destruction. "We don't have time," Benjamin replied, checking his watch. "Alan has another meeting at 10. We just need to finalize this so we can all move forward." Move forward. He spoke as if our marriage were a stalled car on the highway, a minor inconvenience to be cleared away. Alan cleared his throat, sliding a thick stack of papers toward me across the granite. "Mrs. Reed, we've incorporated the terms discussed. It is, as Mr. Reed insisted, a very generous settlement. You'll have the allowance, the relocation window, and the one-time payout. It's significantly more than what a court might award given the separate property designations." I looked at the documents. I saw the clauses designed to strip me of my rights to the business I had helped build. I saw the paragraphs intended to silence me. I saw the generosity that amounted to less than the price of one of Benjamin's vintage Ferraris. "It seems very thorough," I said, running my finger along the edge of the paper. I could feel Benjamin watching me, waiting for the crack, the sob, the plea, the hysterical accusation. He wanted the drama of a woman defeated. It would have validated his narrative that I was the one who couldn't handle the reality of our growth apart. Instead, I looked up and met his gaze. I gave him the smile I had perfected over 1,000 corporate functions. The practiced smile that projected warmth while giving nothing away. "I just want you to be happy, Benjamin," I said. The words were a masterpiece of double meaning. I did want him to find his version of happiness, the kind that comes with the cold realization of what you've lost. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen. The weight of it felt like a scepter. As I signed each page, I felt a surreal out-of-body sensation. I was signing away my home, my name, and my history. But with every stroke of the pen, I was also signing his arrest warrant. Every Sienna Reed I scrawled was a link in the chain I had already forged and handed to Sarah. Benjamin watched the pen move, his chest expanding with a visible sigh of relief. He thought he was winning. He thought he was outmaneuvering the pretty head that couldn't understand business. He saw a woman surrendering. He didn't see the predator who had already set the trap. "There," I said, sliding the final page back to Alan. "It's done." "Thank you, Sam," Benjamin said, his voice softening just enough to be insulting. He reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back, adjusting the cuff of my blue dress. "I'm glad we could do this with dignity. You've always had so much grace." Grace. The word felt like a hot iron. He was praising the very quality I was using to dismantle him. Alan gathered the papers with a brisk, professional snap. "I'll have these filed by the afternoon. You'll receive the final decree within 30 days. I'll be out of the house sooner than that," I promised. "I've already begun organizing my affairs." Benjamin smiled. A genuine, triumphant smile. He looked like a man who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover without losing a single share. "Take your time, Sam. I'm not in a rush to push you out." He was lying. I knew Vanessa's bags were already packed, waiting in her condo for the moment the all clear was given. But I just nodded, that same frozen beautiful smile fixed on my face. After they left, the silence that rushed back into the kitchen was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the last few months. It was the exhilarating, terrifying calm of a fuse that had reached its end. I stood in my blue dress, staring at the spot where the papers had been. In 2 hours, the email from Truth.Finder 2023 would land in the IRS portal. By tomorrow, the federal agents I had watched from the library would be standing in this very foyer. Benjamin thought he had bought his freedom for the price of a few years of alimony. He had no idea that he had just signed away his empire, his reputation, and his liberty. He had walked out of the house thinking he had successfully discarded a middle-aged woman. He had no idea he had just been outplayed by his own architect. I walked to the sink and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were perfectly steady. The storm was coming, and I was the only one with an umbrella. "Goodbye, Benjamin," I whispered to the empty room. I looked at my reflection in the window. The woman in the blue dress didn't look like a victim. She looked like a reckoning. The calm was over. It was time for the world to burn. There is a specific surgical silence that precedes the death of a reputation. It isn't a lack of sound but a suspension of it, the intake of breath before a scream, the pause before the guillotine's blade kisses the neck. I sat at a window seat in Maggie's cafe, a small unremarkable sanctuary of caffeine and grease that offered an unobstructed view of the Meridian Building's glass and steel arrogance. I looked at my watch. 9:44 a.m. The latte in my hands was warm, but the heat didn't reach my bones. I was dressed in a simple sharp gray suit, a professional shroud for the woman who was about to witness a demolition. Across the street, the sun glinted off the Meridian's windows, making the building look like a pillar of light, a monument to the man who thought he owned the sky. Benjamin was up there, probably in his corner office, sipping an espresso and laughing with Vanessa about how easily he'd dispatched the ghost of his past. Then they arrived. 3 unmarked black sedans pulled to the curb with the synchronized grace of a funeral procession. The doors opened in perfect unison. 8 men and women in dark, clinical suits stepped out. They didn't run, they didn't shout. They moved with the terrifying rhythmic efficiency of a machine designed to dismantle lives. They carried briefcases and document boxes like weapons of war. 2 uniformed officers flanked them, their presence the only loud note in a very quiet invasion. I watched, mesmerized, as they entered the lobby. This was the federal choreography, the cold, unstoppable dance of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They were the ghosts I had summoned, the forensic spirits I had fed with 22 years of evidence. Within minutes, the building's internal pulse began to falter. From my vantage point, I could see the security guards in the lobby talking frantically into their radios. The elevators were held. The glass tower, once a symbol of impenetrable success, suddenly looked like a transparent cage. My phone, resting on the wooden table next to my latte, began to vibrate. Benjamin. The screen glowed with his name, the name I had once associated with safety, with home, with a future. Now it was just a label for a crumbling entity. I didn't answer. I watched it dance across the table until it went silent. Then it started again. And again. The vibrations were a frantic electronic heartbeat, a desperate signal from a drowning man. I took a sip of my latte. Tasted like ash. I felt no triumph, no surge of adrenaline-fueled joy. Instead, I felt a hollow, echoing thud deep in my chest, the sound of a titan hitting the ground. I thought of the years I had spent polishing his armor, ensuring that not a single scratch of scandal or failure touched him. I had been the silent architect of his invincibility, and now I was the one who had pulled the plug on the life support. On the 5th call, I finally slid my finger across the screen. "Sienna." Thank God. His voice was a jagged mess of panic and fury. It wasn't the voice of the CEO. It was the voice of the boy in the studio apartment, the one who realized the walls were closing in. "Sienna, something is happening. The feds. They're here. They have warrants. They're seizing the servers, the ledgers. Everything. I need you to come down here. They're asking about the joint accounts from 2019. You have the records, right? You can explain it." I leaned back against the vinyl booth, my eyes fixed on the Meridian's entrance. "I'm rather busy today, Benjamin. I said. My voice was a flat, horizontal line, devoid of any inflection. Busy? Sienna, listen to me. They're talking about tax fraud. They're talking about the pension fund. It's some kind of mistake, a whistleblower, they said. Someone has been feeding them lies for months. I need you to talk to them. Tell them you handled the household books. Tell them I didn't know. But you told me not to worry my pretty head about it, remember? I interrupted, my tone cutting through his hysteria like a razor. You told me the business was too complex for me. You told me I was just the wife. There was a silence on the other end, a sudden vacuum-like void. I could almost hear the gears of his mind grinding as he processed the coldness in my tone. You, he whispered. The word was a realization and a death sentence combined. It was you. You did this. I didn't do anything, Benjamin, I replied, and for the first time a faint bitter smile touched my lips. I just stopped protecting you. I stopped being the foundation. I just signed the papers and walked away. The house was already hollow. I just let the wind in. I'll destroy you, he hissed, the charisma finally stripped away to reveal the feral, cornered animal beneath. I'll make sure you get nothing. I'll tell them you were the mastermind. Goodbye, Benjamin, I said softly. I ended the call and switched the phone off. The vibration stopped. The silence returned, more profound than before. 10 minutes later, the double glass doors of the Meridian building swung open. The federal agents emerged, but they weren't alone. In the center of the phalanx was Benjamin. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The charcoal gray power suit, the one that had cost $5,000, the one I had picked out because it made him look commanding, now looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. Without the pedestal of his office, without the shield of his assistants and his lawyers, he looked small. He looked old. He looked like a man who had spent his life stealing other people's light, and was now realizing he was nothing but a shadow. The agents led him toward the waiting sedans. A small crowd of office workers had gathered on the sidewalk, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. These were the people he had robbed. These were the people whose retirement funds he had burned to buy his happiness. As he was ducked into the back of the car, he turned his head. For a split second, his eyes scanned the street, searching for a face, an ally, a witness. He looked toward the cafe. I didn't move. I didn't hide. I sat in the window, my gray suit a reflection of the overcast sky, and I watched him. Our eyes met across the distance. A 22-year distance that had collapsed into a single freezing moment. I saw the recognition in his gaze, the shock, and finally the profound, terrifying realization of his own insignificance. He had discarded me because he thought I was weak. He was going to prison because he didn't realize I was the only thing that had ever made him strong. The car door slammed shut. The sedans pulled away, moving back into the flow of city traffic, as if they hadn't just removed a mountain from the skyline. I remained in the booth for a long time after they were gone. I looked at the Meridian building. It was still there, gleaming and grand, but it was a corpse. The life had been drained out of it. The hollow thud I had felt in my chest settled into a deep aching fatigue. It wasn't the fatigue of a victim. It was the exhaustion of a long, grueling labor. I had spent 22 years building a man, and 6 months dismantling him. I stood up, leaving my half-finished latte and a generous tip on the table. I walked out into the cool morning air. The scent of the city, exhaust, rain and fresh bread, filling my lungs. The House of Reed had fallen. The name I had carried for over 2 decades was now a stain in the public record. I started walking not toward the house, but toward the federal building 6 blocks away. I had an appointment with Agent Rivera. The federal building was a monolith of gray granite and reinforced glass, a structure that didn't bother with the ornate pretenses of Benjamin's limestone fortress. It was a place designed for the cold, unvarnished truth. A labyrinth of linoleum corridors and heavy steel doors where the air tasted of industrial disinfectant and the weight of overdue consequences. I walked through the metal detector, the blue silk of my dress replaced by a sharp, charcoal wool suit that felt like armor. I wasn't here to be a wife. I was here to be a witness. Agent Carlos Rivera was waiting for me in room 412. He was a man composed of sharp angles and weary eyes, a human lie detector who had spent his career untangling the webs woven by men like Benjamin. The room was small, lit by the relentless hum of recessed fluorescent lights that made the skin look pallid and the soul feel exposed. On the table sat a digital recorder, its small red eye blinking like a steady, unblinking judgment. "Mrs. Reed," Rivera said, gesturing to a plastic chair that felt intentionally uncomfortable. "Or should I say Ms. Davis?" "Sienna is fine," I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the sterile space. "He didn't start with the crimes. He started with me." He scrutinized my file, my honors degree in finance, my early career at Davis & Weber, the high marks I'd earned before I vanished into the Reed name. His skepticism was a palpable, cold pressure in the room. "You have a formidable educational background, Sienna," Rivera noted, tapping his pen against a folder. "You helped launch the company. You were there for the initial acquisitions. To the IRS, it looks improbable that a woman of your intellect could be oblivious to $28 million in irregularities over 8 years. This was the hurdle. The law didn't understand the psychological amputation that happens in a marriage of traditional values. It didn't understand how a man can slowly, meticulously lobotomize his partner's agency, while whispering that he's doing it for her own protection. Intelligence is not a shield against erasure, Agent Rivera, I said, leaning forward. My hands were clasped on the table, a study in forced composure. For 22 years, my husband conducted a masterclass in making me invisible. He didn't lock me in a basement. He locked me in a social role. He replaced my voice with his own until I forgot the sound of my own thoughts. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the journal, the one I had kept hidden in the spare tire well of my car for months. I slid it across the table. It was a battered, leather-bound book, its pages thick with the handwriting of a woman trying to find her way out of a fog. "This is my record of exclusion," I whispered. Every time I asked about a ledger and was told to go pick out wallpaper. Every time a door was locked with a fingerprint scanner I wasn't allowed to touch. Every time I was told that the business was too complex for my pretty head to handle. Rivera opened the journal. The room fell into a deep, heavy silence as he read. I watched his eyes move over the dates, the recorded snippets of dialogue, the descriptions of the patronizing dismissals. He saw the systematic erosion of a human being. He saw the lavish expenditures I had questioned, the Aspen house, the Ferraris, and the documented lies Benjamin had used to explain them away as tax-advantaged corporate leases. "August 14th, Rivera read aloud. "Asked Ben about the Apex Stratagem wire transfer. He laughed, told me I should spend more time at the spa and less time reading his faxes. He bought me a diamond tennis bracelet that afternoon. I felt like I was being tipped for my silence." Rivera looked up. The skepticism in his eyes hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was being replaced by a grim, forensic curiosity. "And when did you decide to stop being pretty and start being a predator?" he asked. "The day I found the hotel receipt," I said. Infidelity is a cliché, Agent Rivera. But for me it was the moment the anesthesia wore off. I realized that if he could discard our history for a girl with jasmine perfume, he had already discarded the woman I used to be. I didn't want the bracelet anymore. I wanted the truth. The next 3 hours were a study in catharsis. For the first time in 2 decades, I was allowed to be the most intelligent person in the room. I walked Rivera through the shell companies, the offshore diversions, and the pension fund raid with the precision of a master architect showing a demolition crew where to place the charges. I watched his expression change from professional neutrality to genuine, startled respect. He stopped treating me like a grieving widow and started treating me like a colleague. He asked for my analysis of the Blue Horizon holdings. He leaned in as I explained the discrepancies in the 2021 tax filings that his own team had missed. "You're very good at this," he said, his voice dropping the interrogator's edge. The words hit me with the force of a tidal wave. "You're very good at this." It was the validation I had been starved of for 22 years. It was the acknowledgement that the pretty head was actually a formidable machine. For a moment, the sterile room felt like a sanctuary. I felt the sharp, intoxicating thrill of being seen, not as an accessory, not as a hostess, but as Sienna. But as the interview drew to a close and Rivera clicked off the recorder, the thrill evaporated, leaving behind a cold, heavy residue. Validation is a double-edged sword. To be recognized as capable now was to realize how much of that capability had been allowed to rot. I looked at the stacks of evidence, the files that would send the man I had once loved to a federal prison for the rest of his life. I saw the 22 years of my youth, my energy, and my brilliance that had been fed into the furnace of Benjamin's ego. Justice was happening. The law was moving. Benjamin would pay. But as I stood up to leave, I didn't feel like celebrating. I didn't feel like the winner of a hostile takeover. "Are you all right, Sienna?" Rivera asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. "I feel like I've just attended a funeral," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "A funeral for a woman who was buried alive 22 years ago. I've just spent 3 hours proving that I spent 2 decades being an idiot for a man who didn't exist." Rivera nodded, a somber, knowing movement. "You aren't an idiot, Sienna. You were a partner." He was the one who broke the contract. I walked out of the federal building and stood on the sidewalk, the city noise rushing back in to fill the silence. The validation felt like a leaden weight in my chest. I was innocent. I was capable. I was right. But the rightness of it didn't return the years. It didn't unring the bell of my erasure. I looked at my hands, the hands that had signed the divorce papers, the hands that had gathered the evidence. They were steady, but they felt old. Justice doesn't feel like a party. Feels like a reckoning. It feels like standing in the middle of a burnt-out forest and realizing that while the fire is out, the trees are still gone. I started my car, the engine a low, mournful hum. The interview was over. The legal separation was complete. Benjamin Reed was a criminal and I was a survivor. But as I drove away from the granite monolith, I realized that the hardest part wasn't bringing him down. The hardest part was going to be learning how to live in the sunlight again, without the shadow of the Titan to tell me who I was. I was Sienna Davis again. 1 year has passed since the world of Benjamin Reed collapsed in a cacophony of sirens and shattered glass. Today, the only sound in my living room is the rhythmic, soothing hum of the city 12 stories below and the soft, insistent chirp of a sparrow perched on my balcony. My new home is not a fortress of limestone and ego. It is a corner unit, modest in its dimensions but vast in its effulgence. It is a glass-walled sanctuary where the sun doesn't just visit, it resides. I stood by the window, a cup of Earl Grey warming my palms, watching the morning light dance across the oak floorboards. This apartment is filled only with the things that hold the weight of my soul. There are no seating charts or impressionistic art pieces, curated to dazzle corporate rivals. Instead, there is my grandmother's hand-stitched quilt, faded and soft, a collection of sea glass I gathered from a beach Benjamin always deemed too rustic for our vacations, and shelves groaning under the weight of books I actually read, finance journals, poetry, and the business law texts I have finally reclaimed. I am no longer a piece of architectural scenery. I am the architect. My return to the professional world didn't happen with a roar, but with a series of quiet, steady steps. I currently lead the Forensic and Compliance Division at Davis & Weber, the very firm I left 22 years ago. Martin Weber had welcomed me back not with pity, but with a professional hunger that validated every sleepless night I spent in those public libraries. In this office, my pretty head is the primary asset. When I walk into a boardroom now, the air doesn't grow cold with my invisibility. It sharpens with the expectation of my insight. I am respected not as a wife who helped, but as a woman who knows exactly how to find the rot in the foundation. But my true pride, the pulse of my new life, lives in a small brick building 3 blocks away. The New Beginnings Foundation. The whistleblower reward from the IRS had arrived 6 months ago. $4.2 million. To the world, it might have looked like blood money, a windfall harvested from the carcass of my marriage. But to me it was restoration. It was the return of the life force Benjamin had siphoned from me for 2 decades. I didn't spend it on Ferraris or Aspen retreats. I used it to seed a future for women who, like me, had been methodically erased by the men they loved. We provide more than just legal aid or financial counseling. We provide an exit strategy. We teach women the language of money, the grammar of independence, and the courage to stop being ghosts. Yesterday, Arthur, our former night janitor, visited the office. He didn't come to clean. He came to show me a photograph of his granddaughter in her graduation cap. Because of the evidence I provided, the federal government was able to claw back the stolen pension funds. Arthur is retired now, living in a house with a porch where he can watch the sunsets he earned. He took my hand, his eyes moist with a gratitude that felt more valuable than any generous settlement. "You saved us, Miss Sienna," he whispered. "No, Arthur," I replied, my voice thick with a quiet, radiant triumph. "We saved ourselves. I just provided the blueprints." As the sun reached its zenith, I began preparing for the evening. I was hosting a small dinner party, my first in this home. There would be no catering staff, no forced smiles, and no strategic networking. Sarah arrived first, her laughter echoing against the glass walls as she hugged me. "You look translucent, Sam," she said, pulling back to look at me. "Like you've finally stepped out of the shadow." "I have," I said, and for the first time in my life I meant it. Martin was there, along with 2 women from the Foundation, survivors who were now my friends. We sat around a simple wooden table, the city lights beginning to emerge like fallen stars. The meal was simple, made with my own hands, seasoned with the joy of a life lived on my own terms. As the evening wound down, Sarah raised her glass of wine, the amber liquid catching the last of the twilight. "To Sienna," she said, her voice steady and warm. "The woman who didn't just survive the storm, but learned how to own the sky." The glasses clinked, a bright crystalline sound that felt like a bell tolling for the end of my morning. I looked around the table at these true friends, people who saw me for exactly who I was. I thought of Benjamin, currently serving his 6-year sentence in a facility where the only thing he owns is his regret. I thought of Vanessa, whose happiness had evaporated the moment the bank accounts were frozen. I felt no malice toward them. Malice requires an attachment, a lingering thread of care. I felt only a profound, somber peace. My 22 years with Benjamin weren't lost. They were a grueling, expensive education that had led me to this moment. They were the fire that had tempered the steel of my resolve. I realized then that I hadn't just survived a divorce. I hadn't just won a legal battle or secured a financial future. I had finally started my life. I am 53 years old, and for the first time I know the sound of my own voice. I know the strength of my own hands. I am no longer a ghost haunting a limestone mansion. I am the sun-drenched architect of a world built on truth, justice, and an uncompromising grace. I took a sip of my wine, the taste rich and deep, and I smiled. It wasn't the practiced smile of a corporate wife. It was the radiant, quiet smile of a woman who had finally found her way home. "To new beginnings," I whispered. The city lights twinkled in response, 1,000 tiny fires burning in the dark. And in the center of it all I stood, warm, bright, and utterly beautifully free. Thank you for walking this long, emotional path with me. It takes a certain kind of strength to face the truth, and I am deeply humbled that you chose to witness my journey from the shadows into the light. If you have ever felt invisible, or if you are currently gathering the courage to reclaim your own sun, please know that you are not alone. I would be honored to read your thoughts or your own stories of resilience in the comments below. Your voice is far more powerful than you know. If this story touched your heart or gave you strength, consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge. It is completely free, and it helps us continue sharing these stories of justice and the unbreakable human spirit.